Here.
Oh, wow. Okay, I just have a question. How can you say anything regarding Jesus, whether he lived or didn't live, by using fake documents such as the Gospels, which you have proven, in my opinion, beyond a shadow of a doubt? So, how can you use it then to prove Jesus didn't exist? When in fact he may have, but the documents may have been destroyed.
Interesting. Okay. Great
That's a
question.
great question.
Go ahead and hang up now and tune in for your answer, okay? Thank you for your call.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's a really great question. Whoever you are, thank you very much. The question is, I speak about Jesus as though he's a historical figure. And the question is, on what basis do I think that Jesus was an actual, real historical figure, as opposed to a composite personality based on someone who lived at a different time? And in truth, I can't know that he was a historical figure. I can't know, no. When what I could know, and what any scholar of the New Testament can know or could reasonably assert, is what did the writers of the New Testament believe, or what did they say they believe? That's an important correction. I don't think Paul believed what he said. So all we can say is, or seek to discover, is what did the evangelist, what did Paul want us to believe? That is accessible. But to say what Jesus believed, said, or that he existed, we could say reasonably that that's speculation. Okay. So it is absolutely speculation to say that Jesus did this or did that. You can have, there are, um, there are methods that are used to try to gain access to someone from the ancient world and go, well, what was this person really like? In fact, as it turns out, all of New Testament all of it is about trying to figure out who was the foundling of Christianity, who was the who was the real Jesus. I mean, there's not 1,000 books on this, not 10,000 books on this. This is what everyone's trying to figure out. Okay, and people have very different views about this, because you're right. The Christian Bible is not just not a reliable source; it is demonstrably a a source that deliberately engaged in chicanery in order to convey Christologies, alter texts, change passages, engage in fraudulent activity when quoting the Jewish Bible in order to shape the life of Jesus. And we could trace this very clearly, and I've been doing this for many, many years. And so your question is very reasonable, given that what I've just said, then how could we even know anything? So we can't know. Like, this is not a science. We can't know that Jesus existed. We could try to, we can attempt to use methodologies like that are somewhat rigorous, like a criteria of embarrassment. We could we could notice that Matthew and Luke, as an example, worked really hard to get Jesus to be born in Bethlehem rather than Nazareth. Okay, so we can see that fiction in the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke, that they want Jesus to be born of a virgin. It may surprise you that the notion that Jesus was conceived miraculously was unknown to the author of Paul's letters, was unknown to Mark, Or Mark just didn't think, whoever wrote the book of Mark didn't think that was important enough to mention. You're arguing from silence. Yeah, this is too huge. And the book of John isn't totally not interested in virgin births because John's not even interested in Mary and never mentions Jesus' mother by name because John is interested in showing that Jesus comes from the eternal past. See the prologue, the first 18 passages of John chapter 1. So John just is not interested in where Jesus came from, not interested in the mother, and Mary is portrayed, is spoken of derisively by none other than Jesus himself at a wedding in Cana. So the question is, how could you say that even Jesus existed? So I'll give you two criteria. And number one is that Matthew and Luke work just very hard to get Jesus to be born in Bethlehem. And they use two very different plot devices to arrange that. Completely different. They're completely inconsistent with each other. What is germane here is that Matthew's infancy narrative has Joseph and Mary begin in Bethlehem. That's where their home is. That's where Jesus is born, in Bethlehem, in the home. There's no inn, there's no manger, there's none of that in Matthew's infancy narrative because Matthew doesn't know anything about it. Luke, in contrast, has the Mary and Joseph start out in Nazareth, and because of a putative census where everybody had to go back to their ancestral home, they had to travel to Bethlehem. So they're very, very different. And the question is, but they all want to get, both of these plot devices work very hard to get Jesus back to Nazareth at some point. In Luke, it's really immediately, meaning a month later. Mary and Joseph return to Jerusalem. She brings the appropriate offerings in the temple and then continues on to Nazareth. And incidentally, if you look at a map and you look at Bethlehem and look at the Upper Galilee and draw a line, it's basically going to pass right through Jerusalem. Okay? Matthew has a very different arrangement. When I say different, these are the most contradictory stories that are, you can't even, there is no real solution to it. Matthew has the family start in Bethlehem, as I mentioned, and then go down to Egypt. Spend a whole bunch of years there until Herod the Great dies, and then when he dies, they can't return back to their home in Judea, meaning Bethlehem, and they have to go to Nazareth, which was outside of the jurisdiction of Herod Archelaus. Okay, so they're totally different. Now the question is, why did they work so hard if the character never existed? If there just was no such thing as Jesus, there's nothing in the ether in the background that was a person who's really born in Nazareth. Like, why work so well? Just write the story that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Like, why do you need Nazareth for? And it's very clear that everybody has Jesus as Jesus of Nazareth. In fact, Jesus is never called Jesus of Bethlehem. It's always Jesus of Nazareth and the Nazarene, right? I mean, no one says Jesus of Bethlehem. They're always referring to him Jesus of Nazareth. So it would seem, it means everything I've shared with you is pointing in the direction that this personality really came from the Upper Galilee, from a one-horse town. I write about this extensively in volume 1 of Let's Get Biblical. So ironically, it is the fiction, it is the lie, it is the made up plot devices, contradictory plot devices of Matthew and Luke that work so hard to get Jesus to be born in Bethlehem, but the family at some point get back to Nazareth and explain that away. Why are they working so hard? that would point us in the fiction, strangely, ironically, would point us in the direction that Jesus was a historical figure who got himself in trouble with the empire, who was from Nazareth, but the Matthew and Luke wanted Jesus to be born in Bethlehem. Why? That's no secret. Because King David was born in Bethlehem. See 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 58. So Matthew and Luke want Jesus to be born in the city where King David was born. And they twist into pretzel, just turn themselves inside out. And Matthew wasn't reading Luke, and Luke wasn't. It wasn't like they can get on the phone. They independently invent two different plot devices. Now, for a point here, I don't think Matthew, like whoever wrote Matthew, I mean, who's responsible for the M source, I am fairly certain that he's collecting oral traditions from wherever he's writing from, and the same could be said for Luke. That means oral traditions develop in different parts of the empire, and then whoever Luke really is, no one knows. Whoever Matthew really is, but these are the people who are the final editors. When I say the word final in italics, they're going to be further editors. They're essentially writing down oral traditions that develop independently in different parts of the empire. So why do you need Nazareth? Like, why? I mean, Nazareth is never mentioned in Tanakh. It's never mentioned in Talmud. Like, Nazareth is really not a very unimportant place. If the archaeology that has been done in the last half a century, going back to the end of the 20th century, is correct, if the archaeologists who say they've discovered the original Nazareth if that's correct, I'm not an archaeologist, that's not my specialty, it really was a one-horse town. I mean, it was like a nothing of a town. So why do you need it? It just seems, so that seems to point us in the direction of a historical figure who somehow got himself on the wrong side of the law with the empire. And he was one of possibly 250,000 Jews during the first century that was executed, body thrown into an unmarked grave, and then later on the passion narratives or the resurrection accounts are invented. And Mark will blunder this completely by saying, because they have to figure out ways, how do you get anybody to go back to the tomb? And like, why would someone go back to the tomb 3 days later? So they come up with all kinds of reasons for it, which make no sense at all. Okay, it make no sense because there's no reason to add spices to a body that's been in a tomb for 3 days. So when you see Mark chapter 16, Luke chapter 24, just the opening, you realize, bang, the story is completely made up. So that would point us in the direction of a historical figure. I'll add one other part to this. It seems from Talmudic literature that there was a character who lived at the time. Now, people are going to right away be all over me on this because they will correctly say that the Jesus in Talmudic literature is dated to a different time, either the 1st century BCE or the 2nd century, and that is correct. So there's one view that, look at this, that the Jesus that we find, the Yeshu that we find in the Talmud is really not in the 1st century at all, and there are mythicists who point to this. And that might very well be the case. There is another view, and it's not an outlier. It's a major view that actually it's all talking about the Jesus of Christianity. And let me just say that whoever this is, he does not come off well in Jewish literature. Now, this is not, I can't prove anything from that. So there is a personality in Jewish literature, really ancient Jewish literature, that seems to be speaking about the Jesus of Christianity fair warning, there is a position that this Jesus didn't live in the first century, but there's another view that actually the text had to be altered because the church was going to kill everybody, so we had to self-censor it, so that's why it appears this way. I want to get to this point. This is something I don't recall ever touching on air, and I think it's valuable. But you got to stay very sharp here, okay? If the Jesus mentioned in Talmudic sources is the Jesus of Christianity, it is very unflattering, okay? So it means no Talmudic author was looking to portray Jesus in any positive light. It's all very negative, okay? However, and this is what's very interesting, but you got to stay very focused now, very sharp now, because this is very tight, very tight. So listen very carefully. So Talmudic sources are hostile to Jesus, very clearly, if that's the Jesus of Christianity. If Jesus walked around claiming that he is the Messiah, then he would be a false Messiah. If Jesus walked around claiming to be a prophet, he would be a false prophet. And it is very clear that Talmudic sources were not being charitable to this Yeshu. And if that was part of his offense, it would have been articulated. What is very striking is that in none of these Talmudic sources is Yeshu, if it is the Jesus of Christianity, held accountable, is charged with and indicted for the crime of claiming to be a prophet when he isn't, or claiming to be the Messiah when he isn't. That would be a very serious crime, major serious crime, right? So the consensus, I don't want to say consensus, but it's close to that. There's scholarship basically weighs heavily on the position, you have to listen very carefully, that the Jesus in the Talmud really is the Jesus of Christianity, although at first glance it doesn't seem to be that because it's dated differently. But rather the Jewish people had to protect the Talmud, so they pushed it back or forward, okay? But if it is the Jesus of Christianity, so that means that there is no indictment in these texts that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah and he was a false Messiah, as there were plenty of false Messiahs in Jewish history. That would be a very serious indictment. And therefore, one can conclude that, in fact, Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah, and that claim was made for him later. That would be consistent with what we find in the earliest gospel. People are confused about the book of Mark for good reason, because virtually every person occupying this planet that has read the book of Mark, all 16 chapters, has already read the book of Matthew because of the arrangement of the New Testament. Matthew comes before Mark. It's really an Augustinian arrangement, but everyone who reads the 679 passages of the book of Mark has already read the book of Matthew, and that colors the glasses of a person who reads Mark, because it's all colored with that. Means you read Matthew already, and people just read Matthew into Mark. And this presents an enormous problem because Mark, as it turns out, is the most interesting of all the Gospels. I say interesting in italics. It's the most curious and also least embellished of all the Gospels. But it's certainly earliest. So the reason why this is very striking is that if you read the book of Mark and just push away the other three Gospels, it's absolutely necessary. If you're not able or unwilling to do this, you're just wasting your time with Mark. The only way you can approach the book of Mark is you have to jettison Matthew completely. You have to get rid of Luke completely. You have to clear your head of those two, the other two synoptic gospels, and read Mark on its own. And what hits you hard fast, what's very striking about Mark, is that through chapter 8, the big secret is that Jesus is the Messiah, and Jesus doesn't want anybody to know that he's Messiah. Shh, don't tell anyone. Okay? So if you read Mark uncolored by Matthew, Luke, and John, if you can do that, so what's very striking about the book of Mark is that the notion that Jesus is the Messiah is a huge secret. Why? How did this meander its way into the book of Mark? It means, why is it there? Think for a moment. If Jesus being the Messiah is the whole point of the New Testament, what possible reason could explain that in the book of Mark it is portrayed that Jesus didn't want anyone to know that he was the Messiah, and no one actually knew? The only reason for it to be there is as an act as an apologetic to explain away a problem. What possible problem could exist? The problem would be is people at that time, this would be just the most logical way of examining this. I mean, this certainly doesn't have to be this way, but this is definitely pointing in that direction. And that is that Jesus actually never claimed to be the Messiah, and that was a claim that was made for him long after he's dead. And therefore, it has to be explained when people going, he's the Messiah. That means the early Christians claim he's the Messiah. Other people said, well, we were around and he never claimed to be the Messiah. So then the book of Mark then puts in that device to say, well, there's reason for it because it was the big secret. Follow? So that secret, the Messiah secret, again points us to a historical figure who never claimed to be a Messiah, and that claim was made for him. Now, I can go further with this, because take Matthew 16, for example. At the end of Jesus' ministry, he's asking the people who've been hanging around with him, 1 year in the Synoptic Gospels, 3 years in John, doesn't make a difference. This is at the end. Who do you think I am? And nobody knows. Nobody knows. What? I thought he's walking around going, I am the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God. No, nobody knows. No one, people are clueless. And it gets even more interesting. We are told in Matthew 16 that Peter then says, Simon then says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Okay? We are told that Jesus then turns to him and says, flesh and blood could not have revealed this to you. Do you understand what that means? We're talking about, this is like Matthew as an example. Matthew is saying that at the end of Jesus' career, prior to the crucifixion, there is no source which Simon, Peter, could have used to determine that Jesus was the Messiah, which means he didn't walk around saying I'm the Messiah, because then he would go, oh, of course, I've been saying it for a year. Like, of course, but so the text has that buried into it. Is it built in? This apologetic is built in. Why is this built in? How did this get in there? Why not have just Jesus walking around going, I'm the Messiah? Okay. Now the explanation that would be most consistent with these anomalies, that's what we're always looking for. We're looking for anomalies in the text. I mean, if you're a geologist and you're trying to find natural gas, you're trying to find gold, whatever, you're looking for an anomaly in the rock formation. This is how scholars study texts. We're not looking for patterns. We're looking for things that stick out that don't belong there. It doesn't belong there. If Jesus is going around saying, I'm the Messiah, in the earlier Gospels, why does nobody know? So it would be consistent that Jesus actually never claimed to be the Messiah. These texts, which stand out, which are very striking, would be consistent with, in fact, the question people posed to the earliest Christians, and that is, why do you think he was the Messiah? He never claimed to be the Messiah, which would indicate that there is then somewhere back in the ether, a historical figure. However, this is not speculation, but we can't know that. As a rabbi, as a person who loves Hashem, forget rabbi, as a person who loves the God of Israel, there's only one question we ask. Is Jesus the Messiah spoken of in Tanakh, or if he's not? If he's not, it doesn't make a difference who he was. If he is, then we should take it very seriously. When we scan the text of the Christian Bible, we find that there is no relationship between the Jesus of the New Testament and the Messiah of Tanakh, and therefore we reject it. But these are the reasons why people could examine these texts and conclude there is somewhere a figure who we could speculate what he might have been like what would have got him in trouble with the empire to get crucified, right? You had to be accused of insurrection, right? If you were a bank robber, that wasn't enough. You had to be accused. So that's how this is done. This is not science like you go to the doctor and you get a blood test done and they can tell you what your blood type is. This is not a hard science. History doesn't work that way. But I've illustrated for you just a number of reasons why one conclude that Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah. And you could see that from the text itself and then from Talmudic sources, if those Talmudic sources are really speaking about Jesus. And it is strikingly the fiction, the lies in the Christian Bible, in Matthew and Luke, that may point us in the direction of there was some figure who really was born in Nazareth, and that's why they both have to work so hard to invent two very different stories that get him to be born in the city in which King David was born in. Thank you for that very interesting question.
Very good.